All right, are all of our judges here? Let's see, check the email real quick.
I only see
Joseph
two.
Stahl. Well, I'm fairly certain Steve is the last judge. Let me confirm that real quick.
Oh, Mr. Harper?
Correct.
Oh, he says but. Oh, okay. So he's not ready yet.
But I need to take care of the other final. Give me just a few minutes. No worries, take your time. Having to push a very large black dog out of the picture is a way too familiar scene for me. All right, great. Looks like everyone's ready. Let's kick off the round with some introductions. Hi, my name is Luke Castle, and I'll be affirming the resolution today. Thank you all so much for taking the time to judge. I really appreciate it.
I am Nathaniel Morgan, as it says if you hover over my picture, and I will be negating the resolution today. And I concur with Luke. Thank you so much for taking your time to judge.
Now, before we jump into the debate, do you want to share a little bit of your past judging experience, maybe a judging philosophy, or just some general judging preferences? What should we do to make sure you enjoy this round and have fun judging? Let's start with you, Mr. High.
Sure. So I'm a student at Oklahoma Christian University. I debate here on the ethics debate team. I debated in high school doing Lincoln Douglas and parliamentary debate. So I can flow anything you say. Just be clear, logical, make it make sense to me, and it'll be on my flow.
All right, great. Thank you. Mr. Stahl? Would you like to share a philosophy or preference? I believe you're on mute, so if you want to share one, you'll have to unmute your mic. All right, we'll come back to you in just a second, Mr. Stahl. Mr. Harper, would you like to share a judging preference or judging philosophy? Tab director. All right, and Mr. Stahl, if you wouldn't mind either sharing a philosophy or confirming either verbally or in chat that you're ready, we can kick this thing off. Okay.
Yeah, you'll want to make sure he's here, because he was here a moment ago, but he might have lost connection.
Yeah, he just dropped off.
Oh, he needs to swap some judges.
All right, let's give him just a second. All right. Idle panels are always an adventure. Yes, they are. All right, Mr. Stahl is back.
I believe Steve said that he was moving him to the other room, so I'm not sure what's going on here.
We'll give him a little second. People communicate when.
Yeah.
Correction. Mr. Stahl said. All right. Mr. Stahl, would you like to share a past judging preference or a judging philosophy before we jump into the debate round? And you are on mute. So feel free to just chat it or speak it. Don't want to start till you're ready.
It says on my computer, at least if you hover over it, says connection lost. So I don't believe he's connected anymore.
Oh dear. Oh, there he goes again. Speaking of adventures, anytime that you get lots of people on a Zoom call. Sorry, room's busy. All right, Mr. Stahl is back. Can you hear and see us okay? And would you like to share a judging philosophy? Yes. Oh, no, he was gray. Now he's gray. now Mr. Stahl is duplicating. Can you hear and see us okay? Oh, nope, there he goes again.
This reminds me of cleaning my room. I try all the time and it just never stays clean.
We can't get it square away in another 5 minutes. We'll drop to a single panel. All right, sounds good. Thanks. Sounds good to me.
That would be a bit strange. 3 judges in my semis round and then 1 judge in finals. Hopefully that doesn't have to happen, but.
You guys can press on and I'll see if they kind of resolve themselves. I think I can hear everybody now.
Oh, I believe, Mr. Stahl, you're super quiet for me, but I think I can hear you.
Yeah, I can hear you.
I'm having some connection issues, so I hopefully you guys can start the round. But I was just going to say I'm going to go silent and just let you guys get started, and I'll just I can hear everybody fine.
Okay, sounds good to me. Once again, thank you all for judging. Glad we got through our difficulties. I'm going to go ahead and put 6 minutes on the clock for the first affirmative constructive if y'all are ready to begin. And I'll just assume you're ready in the future. Here we go. Imagine for just a second that there's a 4th person in this call. I'll call him Bartholomew. He's a thief who just got out of prison. He turns on his webcam and starts ranting about how wrong it was that he was in jail for 20 whole years for just one little bank robbery. Frankly, no one would sympathize with Bartholomew. He took someone else's property, they got their property back, and he was punished for it. Because the simple fact that property rights still are inherently valuable rings through to true in our debate round today, I affirm our resolution. Result: protection of intellectual property ought to be valued above open source innovation. Now, before I jump into why, let's clear up what those terms mean. My first definition is that of intellectual property, and it comes from Oxford. Quote, a work or invention that is the result of creativity, such as a manuscript or design to which one has rights and for which one may apply for a patent, copyright, trademark, etc. End quote. My second definition is that of open source, which American Heritage Dictionary defines as, quote, open to public participation as in the sharing of information. End quote. Here's the conflict. Protecting intellectual property means we recognize people's rights to control their creation, even if they're giving it away. Open source innovation means people give up the control of their information and replace it completely into the public domain. Now, there's one point of resolutional analysis to kind of clarify the scope we're looking at. Go and write it down as enacted by governments. There's only one actor that's capable of changing the standard on intellectual property, and that's the government. No matter how hard a business or organization's campaigns for intellectual property or open source innovation, unless the government makes a policy or takes a stance on it, we're unlikely to see a major change. I'm not saying we need to explore the public spectrum, but we do need to focus on the largest mover and shaker, looking at this from a governmental lens. Now, for you to decide who wins the Lincoln-Douglas value debate, you need a value or a standard. I present the value of the right of exclusion. Now, James Darren, a professor at William & Mary Law School, defines the right of exclusion as, quote, the right to prohibit one or more persons from using a particular resource, end quote. The right to exclude is really simple. We use it all the time. It just says the rights holder gets to control what happens with their thing. For instance, if your child comes up to you and says, hey, can I borrow your phone? Regardless of your answer, you are exercising your right of exclusion, your right of control over that item. Now, there's 2 reasons I want you to use this as the value for our debate round. You can write down my first value link as essential to property rights. Thomas W. Merrill, a professor at Columbia Law School, tackled this issue in a 1998 Nebraska Law Review. Quote, the right to exclude others is more than just one of the most essential constituents of property. It's the sine qua non. Give someone the right to exclude others and you give them property. Deny someone the exclusive right and they do not have property, end quote. Think of it this way. I can tell you, you own your pen that you're flowing this debate around with as much as I want. But if I don't recognize your right to exclude Nathan from taking it and making it his private possession, I don't recognize your right to property. If we don't have the right to exclude, we can't uphold one of the most fundamental human rights. Here's the second reason I want you to use it as our value, or my second value: moral imperative. Any moral system first has to prioritize fundamental human rights. John Locke defines human rights as life, liberty, and property. Let's focus on that last one. Remember, if we don't have the right to exclude, we don't have property rights. If a government says you have the right to buy and own a house, but also we're just going to force you to allow anyone who wants to come in to enter that house and stay there, you don't really own a house. My parents lend me their car, but I can't exclude them from getting into it. Therefore, I do not own it. In 1776, this happened with the American Army. So in the Third Amendment in the Constitution, we ruled that Americans didn't have to quarter soldiers in their home. These all reflect a culture that values basic human rights. If we want to value human rights, we have to put the human rights, we have to put the right to exclude first. If we don't, society will crumble and morality will be failed. So now the only question is, does intellectual property or open source innovation best support the right to exclude? Well, I have two contentions to tackle that issue. You write down my first contention as open source innovation ignores the right to exclude. Definitionally, open source hates the idea of the right to exclusion. The idea of open source is everyone owns everything and no one owns anything. The problem is that sharing everything unconditionally requires us to forego that right of exclusion. Here's my first application. Go ahead and write it down as Chinese ripoffs. You might have noticed China is coming out with a lot of technological inventions lately, but most of them didn't come from China. Their government still takes a very open source approach to software, believing everything should be free. Now, according to The Guardian in March of 2020, the United States has already taken in 19 people in 2020 as of March for stealing property and helping it to get to China. But we can't recover from the thousands of lost dollars that our economy suffers based on China valuing open source. Because China values open source, the United States economy suffers because we don't have a right to exclude and we cannot keep our ideas safe. Here's a better option. Contention number 2, protection of intellectual property upholds the right of exclusion. Thomas W. Merrill, a professor at Columbia Law School, writes for the Nebraska Law Review, quote, "The law with respect to intangible rights and intellectual property is, if anything, even more striking to the degree to which property rights and the right to exclude go hand in hand," end quote. In fact, the Supreme Court ruled in 1984 in Ruckelshaw versus Monsanto Co. that the United States would continue to recognize intellectual property as upholding a right of exclusion. I don't have a specific example for you because protection of intellectual property isn't something we feel the need to put in the news. Thousands of businesses create ideas, file for patents every single day. They then take those ideas to make those ideas a reality and move into progressing society. But it all starts with one thing: valuing their basic right to exclude others from their work, valuing the fundamental human right that your creation deserves to be recognized as yours. The only way to act morally in this resolution is to uphold intellectual property. Thank you.
I'm going to take like 10 seconds of prep time before CrossX to write down what you just said as a quote so I can quote you later. So give me 10 seconds. Okay. 3 minutes on the clock.
Okay.
Let's get started. So do you believe that intellectual property protection is a human right?
I believe that it is necessary for the right to exclusion, which is foundational to property rights, which is a human right.
That doesn't answer my question. I'm asking you if intellectual property protection in and of itself is a human right, something we're entitled to.
I do believe that it is necessary to uphold human rights, yes.
That doesn't answer my question once again. I'm asking you to answer yes or no. Is intellectual property protection a human right?
I've said yes twice, and I'm going to say it again. Yes.
Okay, so just to confirm, you believe that the protection of intellectual property is in a right that people are entitled to by virtue of being alive.
In order to have the right to exclude, we must have intellectual property, and we can't have property rights without the right to exclude. So yes.
Okay. Do you believe that intellectual property and property are interchangeable terms?
I believe that they are different terms, but they come back to the same core principle.
Okay. Are property rights universal?
I believe I think everyone who creates something has property rights.
Okay, so they apply to everyone, regardless of like race or gender, right?
Yes.
Okay. Do they apply eternally? So are they like regardless of the time?
I would say that they've always existed. Unfortunately, I don't really know much about the caveman ages, but I would say in our modern society, everyone recognizes property rights, except for China.
Okay. Does a patent last forever?
Patents don't last forever, but they last long enough. But they last long enough to ensure that creators are credited with their work.
Interesting. So you would agree with me that the protection of intellectual property ends at some point. It becomes public domain if when the patent expires.
Yes, but you're within the current system, you're eligible with renewals as long as you're alive.
Okay, but you would agree that it's the individual's responsibility to get their intellectual property protected, right?
I mean, it's also my responsibility to make sure that people don't steal my patents.
Okay. You mentioned the Chinese ripoffs. Do you believe that Chinese ripoffs, like them taking and breaking the law, do you believe that's open source innovation?
Well, their government does value open source innovation, and they do take our code, which would be freely sharing information, so it definitionally works.
Okay, so them stealing from us, even though people don't want them to be stolen, that's open source innovation?
It's justified by their government valuing open source innovation, yes.
Okay, but that's not the same thing as open source innovation itself, right?
Well, I beg to differ. With a governmental actor, it would be the same.
Interesting. You mentioned a moral imperative. If the right of exclusion is not, well, okay. Do you believe that the right to life is important?
Yeah, I think the right to life is really important.
Okay. So if I were to steal something from you or take your right to life, which one would be worse or detrimental to you?
I mean, personally, I would rather stay alive. It would depend on what you're taking. Like, if you're taking literally everything I own, then I might die anyway, so they're kind of interchangeable.
Okay, but can we agree that the right to life is more important than the right to property?
I think that the timer went off. I'm going to go ahead and finish answering the question.
Okay.
I think that I believe that the negative right to life is more valuable than the negative right to property.
Interesting. Okay, I won't need any prep time. I have 7 minutes on the clock. And with that out of the way, I'll go ahead and begin. The right to exclude is something that people voluntarily give up when they choose to open source innovate. And as such, it's not the best way to be weighing this resolution. But moreover, if we value protection of intellectual property, we violate individuals' fundamental right, that is, their right to life. And that's why I stand against the resolution today. I agree with my opponent's definitions, but I want to provide my own counter-resolutional analysis. He said enacted by the government, and I believe this is a very flawed way of looking at the resolution. My counter-resolutional analysis is of models. Once again, models. What we're looking at in this resolution is individuals choosing to protect their intellectual property or value open source innovation. These are two different spheres of influence that conflict in the software industry, in the medical industry, and just development in general. But what he's trying to say here is that it's the government either forcing people to open source innovate or forcing people to get their protection or protecting their intellectual property. But the resolution doesn't say promotion or forcing open source innovation. It just says the open source innovation as an idea. This is a flawed way of looking at it, and thus this has two impacts. The impact number one is of not forcing. In other words, it's voluntary. When people decide to engage in open source innovation, they voluntarily give up their right to exclude. Just like if I gave away something that I owned, I would be giving up my property rights to that thing. My impact number two is of value doesn't help. His value of right of exclusion only applies if this resolution analysis holds true. I'm going to outweigh his value and show why it's less important than the right to life anyway, but this doesn't actually help us make a decision because individuals choose to give up the right to exclusion, and we should value that decision just as much as the right to exclusion itself. So now I have three contentions for you after I get into my value, which is of right to life. Once again, right to life. I have two reasons for this. Reason to prefer number one is of moral imperative. You notice I'm mimicking what Luke said. I agree that the right to exclusion is important, but it comes under the right to life. When we're talking about human life at stake, that's irreversible. And that's my second reason to prefer. Irreversible. You can get property back and you can earn money that you spent or someone stole from you, but you cannot get back human life. That's why this is the most important thing in the debate round, and it should come up before the right to exclude. I have three contentions for you today, showing you why at the end of the day, Luke's case fails on many fronts, and more importantly, the open source innovation protects the right to life and allows more people to stay alive, and thus it's more important. Contention 1 responds to his entire case, his contention 1 and contention 2 in the application. Contention 1 you can write down is of right to exclude or right of exclusion subjacent. Now, subjacent is my new favorite word, and it literally means to throw under. What I mean by this is that the right to exclude is underneath the right to life. It's not as important. Subpoint A under this is of not a human right. According to Nancy Flowers, writing for the University of Minnesota Human Rights Center in 1997, quote, human rights are the rights a person has simply because he or she is a human being. Human rights are held by all persons equally, universally, and forever, end quote. So if something is a human right, it needs to be held by everyone forever. It cannot be taken away. But the problem is with patent protection, it expires. It doesn't last forever. He claimed in Crossex that you can renew it indefinitely, but that's not true for everything, especially patents, because when that expires after 20 years, then everyone has the public domain, which shows that we aren't really valuing it like a human right in the real system. Subpoint B under this contention is of temporary. Once again, temporary. The right of exclusion, when applied to intellectual property specifically, is not a human right. And Luke was loath to try and agree to this, and he's trying to draw this logical link because property rights are human rights, and because the right of exclusion applies to intellectual property, therefore, right of exclusion is a human right. That's not a logical syllogism, and it doesn't work here. And so the impact of this contention is of not a moral obligation. It's not our moral obligation to uphold the right to exclude because, as we've proven, it doesn't actually apply because it's temporary. It's not a human right, and thus it's just something like the right to vote. It's not our moral obligation to uphold people's right to vote. It's good and it's beneficial for society, but it doesn't have any moral ties to it. So that's and I want to respond to his contention one about open source innovation ignores the right to exclude. My response is of breaking the law, not open source innovation. This was people going in and taking stuff from the United States when they didn't want them to. That's not open source innovation. Open source innovation is voluntary by definition. So, and I actually want to bring up my own definition of open source, which is a little more specific than his, from dictionary.com, quote, open source, pertaining to or denoting a product or system whose origins, formula, design, etc. are freely accessible to the public, end quote. I believe this definition is better than his Oxford definition, simply because it's more specific and it talks about the whole of the sector and it says that it's freely accessible to the public. That's my reason to prefer. Okay, let's get into my remaining two contentions, showing you why the right to life is upheld by the negative side of this resolution. My contention 2 is of intellectual property protection, or IPP, violates the right to life. Subpoint A is the application of the medical industry. As Dr. Robert Pearl writes in 2017, quote, patent protection was never intended for use in a situation when human life was endangered through its use, end quote. Unfortunately, however, this is exactly the case in our medical system. We are using patents and denying people access to life-saving treatments. As Dr. and Professor Peter C. Ghosh, writing for the European Journal of Clinical Investigation in 2018, states, quote, the main problem is that the current system is based on patents and monopolies, which allow companies to set the price as they want. This system is unethical, as people may die if they cannot get access to the drug they need. It's also inefficient as research knowledge is not shared, end quote. This is the main problem with the current system, is that when we protect intellectual property, we violate individuals' right to life because they cannot get access to drugs because they're too expensive. We should never forego the right to life just for some philosophical right to exclusion, which is not a human right anyway. So let's move into contention 3, which is of open source innovation saves lives. Subpoint A under this is of the public benefit. As Jeff DeGraff writes in 2015, quote, this is the mindset behind today's open source movement. Unrestricted access to designs, products, and ideas to be used by an unlimited number of people in a variety of sectors for diverse purposes, end quote. The reason why open source innovation is so beneficial is because it allows free access. It allows everyone to collaborate and work together on stuff. That saves lives in, as it says in my application, chronic disease management. I have a study here talking about an open source electronic health records, and it said that that was more efficient and allowed more people to be treated and cured with chronic disease management. And my application 2 is of earthquake warning systems. As Andres Mira writes on OpenEEW, quote, earthquakes killed between 700,000 people between 2000 and 2010, and almost a third of the world's population living in seismically active regions, end quote. And it goes on to talk about this open source innovation initiative where they created a product that allowed open source to deploy this earthquake warning system in people's homes. You are muted.
3 minutes on the clock for Crossex if you're ready.
I'm ready.
All right. Do you think the Supreme Court is a trustworthy source?
For most things, yeah.
Do you think they normally make pretty good decisions and have pretty good stances on things?
On what the law says, yes.
All right, great. Now, you brought up this whole idea about the specific about how it violates the medical industry. Did you have any specific applications underneath contention 2?
Yes. I read a study.
Okay, aside from the study, anything that happened in the real world?
Yes.
Was anything presented in the speech?
Yes.
What was it?
I talked about this. It was a study talking about, I believe it's called the electronic health records, and it was a specific study talking about this company that is, or it was a healthcare facility that decided to use open source healthcare records and worked better.
Thank you, Nathaniel. Now, when was the last time that someone donated $2 billion to a not-for-profit? Just off the top of your head.
I don't know.
Can we agree that typically nonprofits don't get $2 billion donations?
Well, I actually know. I think they probably do sometimes, but I don't know about specific examples.
Okay, so you think that people pretty frequently donate $2 billion to nonprofits?
No.
So would you say it's an infrequent incident, just based on common sense?
Sure.
All right. Are property rights important?
Yes.
Can we agree that patents are renewable in most instances?
No.
So you don't think patents are renewable?
I see no evidence to say that, and I don't see any reason.
In most countries, you can't renew a patent.
I don't even know if this is true in the U.S., much less in most countries. So I cannot agree to that.
Okay, so you just don't know.
You have not presented evidence, so I cannot agree to it.
Can we agree that the right to exclude is essential to property rights?
It is a part of property rights, so of course.
Okay, so we would need it to have property rights, correct?
It is property rights, basically.
All right, and so you think property rights are foundational right, human right, correct?
They're a part of human rights, yes.
If we give away ideas, can we take them back and protect them?
Yeah.
So if I tell everyone in the world a piece of information, I can then make them all forget it so I can control it again.
No, that's not the same thing.
Okay, so we can agree once information shared, we can't get it back.
Well, we can't unshare it, but we can definitely have access to it.
So then giving away ideas freely would be permanent, right?
Yeah.
And if you can't get it back, you don't have control over it, obviously, right?
Well, you do have a control over the idea. You just don't have control over whether or not other people can use that idea to benefit them.
Okay, so you don't fully control it anymore, correct?
Sure.
All right, and can we agree that protecting ideas upholds the ability to exclude people from them?
I don't know. I would have to think about that.
So do you think that controlling our ideas produces an ability to control them?
I'm not sure. I'd have to think about that.
Interesting. No further cross-examination time. I'll put 3 minutes on the clock for prep. Starts now.
You are still muted, Luke.
Sorry. Stopping prep time. I've got 1 minute and 28 seconds remaining. Those mute buttons are annoying, aren't they? I'm going to put 4 minutes on the clock, the length of the first affirmative rebuttal, if all my judges are ready. I'm going to assume so and jump into this first speech. There's great news. There's really only two arguments in this round that matter. The first is what you believe on the right to exclude, and my opponent basically conceded that one in cross-ex. The second one is your opinions on the intellectual property and whether or not it upholds the right to exclusion, which has been affirmed by the Supreme Court. So I'll quickly clean up the flow, but I'm going to be moving back to the points that matter, because those are the ones that will be warranting your decision. Keep those in mind. Now, first, you brought up this whole idea about the resolutional analysis. My response is, in response to his first impact, movers and shakers. I'm not saying to totally ignore the public sector, but the government is going to get more done in this industry than the public sector. Let's focus on government, because they're the ones who can make the change. In response to the idea of how the value doesn't uphold, my response is not warranted. This does no warrant, and that doesn't make any sense. Just remember this. And we're not talking about the government forcing IP protection or forcing open source innovation protection. We're talking about the government making policies that support one or support the other, not forced, supported. Now, in response to the value of right to life, I'm going to start by refuting his value link B. My response is that of not threatened. Now, he's talking about how it's an imperative because it's threatened, but I don't believe it's actually threatened in our resolution. So his value links don't stand because it's not an issue. Now, in response to the idea of moral imperative, my response is non-unique. Moral imperative and irreversible are non-unique, as property rights and information can't be retained, as my opponent conceded. Now, in response to his first contention about how the right to exclude is subjective, I got two responses. First, Sally versus the Supreme Court. I think Sally's great. She's probably really smart. She was very articulate in the quote he read. She's also going up against Thomas W. Merrill, one of our most famous lawyers and the Supreme Court of the United States. So I'm pretty sure that those two sources believing this is a human right kind of outweighs the blog post. My second response is that it didn't refute logic, or about a clear logic which my opponent conceded in cross-ex. Property rights are foundational. We need the right to exclude for property, and intellectual property upholds the right to exclude. They can't just say this without refuting the logical chain. Now, he brought up this whole idea about how patents expire and how they're temporary. My response is renewals. In the majority of countries, you can renew your patent until you die. So renewals exist, and this isn't a conflict. Responding to the idea of breaking the law, not open source innovation, justifies. Maybe it wasn't the heart of open source innovation as my opponent has it. He seems like a nice guy. But it's what open source innovation is justifying in our society. It's what it's doing in the real world. Now, in response to the dictionary.com definition, that's in a really weird spot. I have two responses. First, less specific. It doesn't really add any specifics. It just adds specifics he wants. And secondly, doesn't really change. It doesn't change our debate round that much. So let's not waste time here. Next, he talked about intellectual property violates the right to exclude and talked about new industries and how it upholds all this stuff. I got two responses. First, creation. He was talking about medical field. And I think that open source medicine sounds really cool until you realize that it costs $2 billion to take a medicine. And most people don't get $2 billion donated to nonprofits. We make thousands of drugs every year. So until you can come up with people who are willing to donate trillions to medical research, that's not going to work too well. My second response is in real life debate. He created a computer program using open source, and he had one example. That's hardly saying it's going to work for $2 billion drug companies and the working of that. In response to open source innovation saves lives, my response to the entire contention is run on IP. He was talking about software, and the fun fact about all those softwares is they run on Windows, which is intellectual property. These couldn't exist without intellectual property. Let's take a step back and focus on the arguments that matter. If you agree with me on these points, I'm asking you to vote for me. First, right to exclude. It's foundational, it's a moral imperative, and that it is a human right. This has been affirmed by Thomas W. Merrill and the Supreme Court in quotations my opponent wasn't able to refute. It comes down to this. The right to exclude is necessary for property rights, which we have a moral obligation to uphold. When looking at positive versus negative rights, governments have to be able to uphold those. My second voting issue you can write down as intellectual property. My opponent hasn't been able to show us why controlling our ideas doesn't uphold the right to control. Because here's the thing, according to the Supreme Court, intellectual property upholds the right to exclusion. Comes down to this. The only right violated in our debate round is the right to exclusion. It's morally superior and intellectual property upholds it. Thanks.
Luke, I'd like you to send me the evidence for your claim about how the Supreme Court said that the right to exclude is a human right.
Yeah, so I had this problem last time. I actually can't send files through the 8x8 chat. If you'll type in 1984, Rockelshaws versus Monsanto Co., you'll be able to read the evidence.
Well, I want your specific card on it. You don't have to send a file, just copy and paste the card that you've cut on it.
Well, that's a physical card. I'll look for the link for you.
Oh, okay. And I'll take my prep time. And what page is this on?
Hold on, let me check. I believe it was around the 25th page. It's if you just read the overall opinion, that's the opinion of the court writes. Oh dear, my paper copy does not seem to have page numbers. Yeah, it's not a specific quote. If you look at the overall summary of the opinion, that's really what it's going to be.
Okay. Okay. This is a 6-minute speech. I'm going to assume my judges are ready. I don't know why, but it says connection lost for Mr. Stahl and Mr. Harper, so it was during your speech as well. Okay, it says he's here, so I'll just continue then. All right, 6 minutes, then I'll begin. As Luke himself said, the only way to uphold morality in this resolution is to uphold the right to exclude. Now, this quotation from Luke is patently false. I've shown you how we uphold morality in this resolution by upholding the right to life, which, as Luke conceded, is more important than property rights. When we have these two things in conflict and they're both at stake within the resolution, we should choose the system that allows more people to stay alive, and that system is open source innovation. Let's talk about the resolutional analysis. He responded by saying movers and shakers, and then my response to this is of doesn't refute. I talked about how the resolution doesn't say government policy is the actor here. It doesn't say that the government is the one doing the open source innovating or protection of intellectual property. He's basically saying it's government policies to promote one thing or the other, but it doesn't say that in the resolution. And he said not warranted for the value doesn't help. My response is of false. I gave a great warrant for this. The reason why it doesn't help is because if it's voluntary, if people are giving up their information voluntarily, then there's no at stake human rights violation or violation of the right to exclude. I have the right to give up my rights to property just like I have the right to give up my right to vote or choose not to exercise it. It's not at stake within this resolution because open source innovation, by definition, is voluntary. It's people voluntarily giving up their information. So his whole entire case fails on this point. And he just is ignoring this and saying it's not warranted, even though I said this exact point under this impact. So I'm going to get into two voting issues, and I'm going to respond to the remainder of the points in this round within those. Voting issue 1 is of intellectual property violates the right to life. I believe that the right to life is, in fact, the value we should be using in this debate round because it is at stake within the resolution. Subpoint A under this is of unethical. As I read evidence for, the current system is unethical because it uses people may die if they don't get access to the drug they need. And in fact, open source does solve this. He said that, oh, people don't just donate $2.6 billion. Well, a lot of the reason why it's super expensive is because people have to do all the research and development themselves, and they can't collaborate with other people. The study that I read that showed that open source health records worked from the Journal of the American Medical Association, Informatics Association, said that, quote, improvements in diabetes management, controlled hypertensions, and increases in tuberculosis vaccinations were assisted through the use of these open source systems, end quote. So in order to get people access to these vital treatments, open source is able to solve. This study by 6 different experts on this proves that conclusively. So as we can see, the right to life is actually at stake within this resolution. It is threatened within the resolution, and the point about the moral imperative being non-unique, my response is of conceded more important. It isn't non-unique that it's a moral imperative. Luke even conceded in cross-examination, the right to life is more important than property rights. And if it's at stake within this resolution, in the medical industry, and in people dying from earthquakes, as I'll get into later, then we need to value that above it. But moreover, the right to exclude is not even a moral right. So before I get into that, I want you to write down subpoint B under this contention, or this voting issue, is of open source solves. I talked about how the open source innovation solves the problem of violating the right to life. And I want to talk about the earthquake warning system under here. So according to the evidence I have here, this is from Andres Mira writing for OpenEEW. Quote, for this reason, we decided to launch OpenEEW, an initiative to share our data, sensor technology, and detection algorithms. Not only will this enable others around the world to start building their own EEW systems, it will also, we hope, lead to the creation of a global community collaborating to develop ever better EEW systems, always with the end goal of providing life-saving alerts and increasing resilience against earthquakes, end quote. Luke's only response to this point that I talked about the earthquake warning systems, which save lives as a result of open source innovation, this initiative, his only response was of runs on IP, but this is patently false. And nowhere in the evidence or any of my applications did I say that it runs on proprietary software. No, this is literally false. It doesn't refute the point here. And as this is the rebuttals and he can't make any new arguments, I would ask him not to respond to any of these individual points because he's dropped the other ones. He cannot make any new responses here. So we see that open source solves the right to life by allowing more people to stay alive by the study that I quoted and talking about how open source intellectual property violates the right to life and it is unethical. The only response he had to this was that it costs a lot of money to create. Well, the cost is brought down empirically, as the study I read proved, because of the because you can share information. They don't have to reinvent the wheel and spend a bunch of money doing that. It's inherently less. I think the treatment for the Ebola virus was only about $500,000, which is ridiculous, ridiculously low comparatively because of open source innovation, because they could build on what other people used, because of the power of open source innovation allowing for public benefit. So now let's move into voting issue 2, which is of right to exclude is not moral. The right to exclude is not moral. What I mean by this is it's not morally at stake in this resolution, because when it applies to intellectual property rights, it doesn't hold up. Luke's logic here is, oh, well, because the right to exclude applies to property rights, therefore the right to exclude is a human right. But that's not actually true. I pointed out that the right to exclude is not only a voluntary thing that people give up, so that's my subpoint A to this, is a voluntary, but it's not just a voluntary thing that people give up, so it's not a human rights violation within this resolution, but more importantly, the logic doesn't apply, because when we look at patents, they are actually temporary. They're not, he basically said, oh, you can renew it as much as you can. Well, if you have to renew it, there's a period in which it's not protected. So therefore, it isn't eternal and it doesn't apply all the time. So just because you can renew it doesn't mean anything here. So the impact of this voting issue is of no reason to vote affirmative. His voting issues about right to exclude intellectual property are patently false. If you look at the logic underlying his contentions, it doesn't stand up. He's not even talking about real open source innovation under his contention, and thus because open source innovation saves lives, it is inherently a better model and you should vote nay.
I have 1 minute and 28 seconds of prep remaining. I'll start that now. I'll be stopping prep time now. I have 3 minutes on the clock. The final affirmative rebuttal. If everyone's ready. At the beginning of my last speech, I had some really great news for you. I have even better news now. The only two issues that determine your vote basically went unrefuted. Let's clean up the flow and move back into the important stuff. For starters, he talks about life versus property. You can group my responses with his first subpoint or his second voting issue, life not threatened. He can't prove to us that life is actually threatened. Sure, life is more important when it's threatened, but he hasn't been able to empirically prove that. I'll talk about that more in a second. Next, he brought up this whole idea about how I didn't refute the major shows and it's not the government. My response is only major change. We're not talking about the government forcing people into actions. We're talking about the government having a patent office or not having a patent office. We're talking about how the government responds and the systems they create. He talked about false. My response is because government, no, this argument isn't false. We have a governmental actor, so it's clearly related. Remember, we're just talking about whether or not to have a patent system. Next, he talked about, I think, this first voting issue, his first subpoint. He talked about unethical, group this with his all of his stuff about cheap with open source. No stats. This is an IRL debate. It's actually happening in the real world. He keeps saying that it's more expensive and we can make it. So tell us about one example. He keeps telling us about all the medicines we can create, but he only has examples of computer softwares. Impact? Not in the real world. We don't have $2 billion to create a free medicine doses for everyone. Great idea, non-realistic. He talks about how open source solves. My response is hasty generalization. He talks about 3 computer systems and says that that's proof they can create drugs. That's dumb. Just because someone can code doesn't mean that they have the money or the ability to create a drug. He talked about this whole idea of earthquakes. My response is runs on Windows. My point here is that that software is great. It also runs on intellectual property, so we couldn't have it without IP. He talked about how he brought up within the creation point, he talked about how he brought it in Daniel and still it's lost money to use open source. My response is still $500,000. So maybe it's not $2 billion. I don't know many nonprofits who have $500,000 to throw around anyway. Either way, we can't afford it. His second voting issue is the right to exclude is not moral. My response is contradiction. In cross-examination, he agreed property rights were foundational and we needed to uphold them. And then he said the right to exclude was part of property rights. He can't make this point because he conceded differently. Finally, in response to the prove unproductive, in response to renew during life, my response is nitpicking. He's saying because we have to renew, it's not valid anymore. That's just silly. No, you can renew beforehand and you won't have an unelected period. Now we've carried through those things, let's move into 2 voting issues. If you agree with me on these things, I want your ballot. First voting issue, right to exclude. It's foundational, it's a moral imperative, and my opponent hasn't fully been able to argue against it. Remember, the Supreme Court of the United States says this is one of the major issues within our round. Beyond that, his value doesn't hold up as it's not helped or harmed by either side of the resolution. Impact, use affirmative value. The only way to weigh this debate is to ask who better upholds the right of exclusion, which is my second voting issue, intellectual property. He hasn't been able to dispute it, and the Supreme Court of the United States says that the idea of intellectual property upholds the right to exclusion. Right to exclusion is the only affected value, and intellectual property upholds it. Vote out. Thank you so much for judging. I appreciate your time.
I believe in clapping.
Great job, guys.
Great job, Luke. Thank you so much for judging us all, and thank you for having a great round with me, Luke.
Yep, thank you as well. And I look forward to reading all y'all's ballots. Have a great day.
Have a great rest of your weekend.